Salutations, respected viewers. This video is a series of my musings on the personality of Donald J. Trump. Has that curious American habit of putting one's middle initial in, even when it's not needed to distinguish one from somebody else. It struck me the other day the way there's a certain verisimilitude between Trump and King Edward VIII. Edward VIII ruled the United Kingdom 1936 to 1939. There are obviously some very major differences between them as well. But here are a few of the striking similarities about both being so egotistical, being highly irresponsible and self-indulgent. They had an unduly high opinion of themselves. Trump, growing up the son of a multimillionaire in New York, I suppose he was raised to think that way about himself, though strangely doesn't seem to have affected his sister or his brother, the one who died very young of dipsomania. And Edward VIII, well, he was brought up, he was going to be Emperor of India, for goodness sake. So you can see why he had a grossly inflated notion of his own worth. But most members of the British royal family have managed to keep their feet on the ground, been fairly sane and known that we're not superhuman. We just happen to be born into this position. So both Trump and Edward VIII had numerous affairs with married women. Trump was doing this a lot in the 1980s. He was married himself at the time, so it's double adultery. Edward VIII, up until he met Mrs. Wallis Simpson in 1935, he was unmarried, and he had affairs with married women back then. That was considered more acceptable for him because if he impregnated his paramour, her baby would be assumed to be sired by her husband, not him. The king and the president both felt disdain for democracy and are open about voicing that. They sympathise with dictators. So they had a fellow feeling for authoritarian leaders, and they both had contempt for non-whites. The thing is that back in the 1930s, this white supremacism was a widespread sort of bigotry. It's no longer so popular now, so Trump can't be excused as being a man of his era. However, the similarity must not be pressed too far. Edward VIII was not a vulgarian, nor was he a braggart, whereas Trump is notorious for his braggadocio. The king did not dodge military service in the First World War, so he was there with, I think it was the Welsh Guards. However, he didn't go right to the front line. He was kept several miles behind. Even then, there was a little bit of danger of shells coming over. So obviously, Trump made up some claim about his heel spurs or something to get out of Vietnam. So Trump is a stranger to reason. He has long since lost touch with reality. He has no objectivity at all. He cannot distinguish fact from fantasy. He's all about me, me, me. He's egomaniacal. He wants to put his name on everything, all his Trump towers. He's extremely simplistic. So Edward VIII wasn't guilty of all that. Trump's been called an idiot by those who know him best. Now that is a gross overestimate of his intellectual ability for a man who doesn't read anything, a man who is gobsmackingly ignorant, and it's just jaw-dropping that 40% of Americans still support him. I suppose the thing is, it would be such a climb down to admit that they've been had. They've been conned by this notorious con man who doesn't give a damn about the working class, who's committed the most flagrant frauds over decades with this Trump University and so on. And it'd be too embarrassing to say, okay, you got me. I was fooled, and what a moron I was to fall for all these empty promises of this absolute chancer and charlatan. So now Trump's aides have been hiding documents for him. He wanted to sign an order ending a free trade agreement with the Republic of Korea, South Korea, maybe at the behest of his soulmate Kim Jong-un, this savage tyrant, just the sort of person Trump gushes over. And Trump had that document disappeared from his desk, and Trump forgot about it. He doesn't notice. Yet another sign of his mental decline. He's got senile dementia, early stage Alzheimer's. No, I'm not a physician, but I think anyone could diagnose him even from thousands of miles away. It's staring you in the face. It reminded me a little bit of Churchill in the mid-50s. Now, Churchill and Trump, okay, very, very different, because Churchill was a man of immense moral and physical courage. He put himself in the firing line countless times in various wars. A man who was a spellbinding orator, who was a towering intellectual. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature, for goodness sake. Whereas Trump is low, craven, moronic, utterly vile. But my point is, when Churchill was in the mid-50s, he'd had a stroke and he was mentally incapacitated, indeed physically incapacitated, for a few days at the time. There was no 24-hour media cycle then, and it was whispered about. The opposition got a hold of it, but the Labour Party didn't use it against him. The press, the media, the newspapers and the BBC were very deferential, and they would never publish this kind of thing. He ought to have stood down on the grounds of ill health, but he carried on to 1955. But his family had to cover for him, and his signature was forged sometimes to keep things going. It's not that he was trying to make irrational decisions. So that's somewhat different from Trump. But now it's a big challenge for people in the White House to try and manage Trump with his very erratic, with his mood swings, with his policy jumping all over the place, him being the ultimate flip-flopper, how opposite that some of his cronies have flipped on him in the Mueller investigation. Well, that's Donald J. Trump, who's all about himself. He wants his name on everything, and he doesn't take his duties seriously. It's all about advancing his own ego. He doesn't care about the position he's supposed to fill, about doing good for the public. That was the similarity that struck me with Edward VIII, the Playboy Prince. But Edward VIII, when he fell in love, he was faithful to his wife, and all the rest of it. But the similarities have both men, they want the baubles of office without having to do the tedious spade work or actually think about the people they're supposed to be serving. That's all.